Lieutenant Commander Sarah stepped off the transport bus at Naval Station San with a duffel bag in one hand and a fabricated service record in the other. The California sun beat down mercilessly on the tarmac as she made her way toward the barracks, her movements deliberately unremarkable, shoulders slightly hunched, eyes cast downward, the posture of someone trying to disappear into the crowd. To every person on this base, she was Petty Officer 3rd Class Sarah Martinez, a transfer from Norfolk with mediocre fitness scores, no commendations, and absolutely nothing that would draw attention. Her real identity, Lieutenant Commander Sarah, one of the most decorated Navy SEAL operators in the history of the program, was locked away in a classified folder accessible only to 3 people: the base commander, the admiral overseeing the investigation, and a handler at the Pentagon who monitored her progress. Walking through the main gate, Sarah felt the familiar weight of dual consciousness settling over her like a familiar coat. This wasn't her first undercover assignment, but it might be her most important. For the past 18 months, Naval Station San had been hemorrhaging qualified personnel. 18 recruits had filed formal complaints about hazing. 23 others had simply vanished from the program, unable to endure the abuse any longer. But here was the problem. None of the complaints had stuck. Every single investigation had gone nowhere. Witnesses recanted their stories, claiming they'd misunderstood or exaggerated. Evidence disappeared. And the perpetrators, they remained on base, untouched, protected by an invisible network of silence that only existed in military culture. The admiral had been frustrated during their briefing at the Pentagon. "We know something is happening," she'd said, tapping her fingers on the classified folder. "We know there's a ring of men operating within that unit, targeting vulnerable recruits, but every time we try to build a case, it falls apart. We need someone inside, someone they won't suspect, someone who can document what's actually happening without triggering their defenses." That's when Sarah's name had come up. Yes, she was a SEAL. Yes, she was overqualified for the job. But she was also small, 5'4", and with her hair dyed darker and her frame deliberately demuscled through weeks of reduced training, she could pass as a fresh recruit who'd somehow slipped through basic training without developing the typical build. More importantly, she had the patience and discipline required for long-term undercover work. She wouldn't rush. She wouldn't react emotionally. She would simply observe, document, and wait. The barracks smelled like 1,000 sweaty recruits who hadn't figured out that deodorant was a necessity rather than a luxury. Sarah claimed a bunk in the corner of the main dormitory, position chosen deliberately for maximum observation and minimum social entanglement. She unpacked her duffel slowly, methodically, each movement designed to convey that she was tired, homesick, and utterly unremarkable. A photograph of her family, actually her handler's extended relatives, people she'd never met but who served the crucial function of making her backstory believable. A pair of worn running shoes. A small Bible. Everything screamed, forgettable recruit trying to get through the program. The other recruits noticed her in the way people notice background noise. They registered her existence without really processing it. She was the quiet girl who read during free time, the one who didn't laugh at jokes, the one who seemed perpetually anxious about meeting standards. Perfect. That's exactly who she needed to be. Over the first 2 weeks, Sarah established her routine with methodical precision. She ran slightly slower than minimum acceptable speeds but never failed a test. She spoke only when spoken to. She made no friends, which was slightly unusual but not suspicious. Plenty of recruits were introverts struggling with the transition to military life. She ate alone in the mess hall, always at the same table, always in the corner. She kept her uniform immaculate but never exceeded the dress code with unnecessary shine or care. She was the definition of mediocrity, the kind of recruit that commanding officers barely remembered and fellow recruits didn't bother to target, at least not yet. But while she appeared invisible, Sarah's eyes and ears were everywhere. She noted which recruits moved in patterns suggesting fear. She observed which older soldiers seemed to have unusual amounts of access to junior barracks. She tracked conversations, language patterns, the subtle body language that indicated a hierarchy of abuse. She documented times and locations, storing them all in her remarkable memory, never writing anything down where it could be discovered. And she waited. Sarah knew that men like the one she was hunting, predators who'd operated successfully for months, had specific preferences. They targeted those who appeared weak. They hunted in packs. They were looking for victims who had few friends, little support, and low confidence. Sarah had made herself the perfect prey. She dangled herself like bait before a shark, knowing that eventually the hunters would circle. She just had to be ready when they did. Because unlike every other victim they'd targeted, this ghost recruit carried the training of an elite warrior and the patience of a hunter. When they made their move, they would discover too late that they'd been hunting her all along, had learned early in life that strength was currency. At 17, when he'd first arrived at the Naval Academy, he'd been smaller than most of his peers, 5'10", lean, with dark eyes that seemed to calculate everything around him. His father had been a drill sergeant, a man who believed that pain was the best teacher and that weakness was a disease that needed to be beaten out of people. Had internalized this philosophy so thoroughly that it had become the foundation of his entire worldview. Now, at 24, with 3 years of active duty already under his belt, he'd learned that the military system was actually designed to reward exactly the kind of behavior his father had taught him. You found people weaker than you. You established dominance. You created a hierarchy. And if you were smart about it, if you never left the kind of evidence that couldn't be explained away, you could operate almost indefinitely. He was tall now, muscular in the way that came from obsessive weight training. His arms bore tattoos of weapons and skulls. His face had a scar across his left cheekbone, the result of a fight with another recruit 3 years ago, a fight he'd won so thoroughly that the other guy had transferred bases rather than face him again. Wore his scarring like a badge of honor. It was a warning, a declaration, a promise that anyone who challenged him would regret it. Tyler was Shadow, his right hand, the one who'd been with him since their first week of basic training. Tyler was lanky and quick, with a nervous laugh that masked a genuine capacity for cruelty. Where was strategic, Tyler was impulsive, which made him dangerous in different ways. Tyler was the one who'd actually initiated the first assault 3 years ago, throwing a junior recruit against a wall over something as trivial as someone looking at him wrong during chow. Had recognized immediately that Tyler had potential, so he'd taken him under his wing, refined his methods, taught him how to be cruel in measured doses. Tyler had become Echo, the one who reinforced every decision, who laughed at every joke, who was always ready to do exactly what asked without question. Jake was the enforcer. While was intelligent and Tyler was eager, Jake was simply violent. He stood 6'3", with the kind of physique that came from genuine athleticism rather than gym obsession. He'd grown up in rural Kentucky, the son of a football coach, and violence had always been his primary language. He hit harder than anyone else. He could make a chokehold last just long enough to terrify without causing permanent damage. He had an intuitive understanding of exactly how far he could push someone before leaving evidence that couldn't be explained away. In their operation, Jake was the muscle that made the threats real. When Jake said something was going to happen, it happened. And then there was Devin Cole, the manipulator. Devin was perhaps the most dangerous of the four, though it took longer to recognize this fact. He was conventionally attractive, with a charming smile that had convinced half the base that he was a genuinely good person. He had a way of talking to people that made them feel special, seen, understood. But it was all calculated. Devin had grown up watching his mother manipulate everyone around her, and he'd learned the trade from an expert. In their operation, Devin was the one who identified targets. He was the one who found recruits with no support systems, no friends, no one who would miss them if they suddenly disappeared into fear. He was the one who convinced victims that what happened to them was somehow their own fault, a test they needed to pass, an initiation they needed to endure. He was the one who made them complicit in their own abuse. Together they ran what could only be described as an operation, not random bullying operation. They had protocols. They had territories. They had a carefully maintained network of junior soldiers who'd been broken enough that they now helped identify new targets in exchange for being left alone. It was sophisticated. It was organized. And it had been working perfectly for 11 months. They'd started small. A junior recruit named had been their first major target. They'd broken him systematically over 6 weeks, using a combination of physical intimidation and psychological manipulation. By the end, was so traumatized that when his commanding officer asked if anything was wrong, he'd simply shaken his head and signed the paperwork to transfer out. He'd rather leave the Navy than continue facing his abusers. The operations had expanded after that. They'd developed a system. New recruits arriving on base would be assessed by Devon, who had an almost supernatural ability to identify vulnerability. Tyler would make initial contact, establishing himself as a potential friend. Then would create a situation where the recruit felt indebted, obligated, or trapped. Jake would deliver the physical reinforcement. And finally, Devon would normalize it, convincing the victim that this was just how things worked in the military, that everyone went through this, that reporting it would only make things worse because nobody would believe them anyway. The military system had actually worked in their favor. The code of silence ran deep. The bureaucracy moved slowly. Complaints disappeared into filing systems where nobody looked. Officers who received reports were often more concerned with protecting their unit's reputation than with investigating their own soldiers. And the victims, scared, disoriented, traumatized, rarely had the courage to push back. Tyler, Jake, and Devon had become something close to untouchable. They developed confidence born from 18 consecutive successful operations. They'd begun to believe in their own invincibility. And they had absolutely no idea that the quiet, forgettable girl sitting alone in the mess hall every single day was actually a Navy SEAL who'd been trained by the most lethal military organization on the planet, and that she'd been sent here specifically to destroy them. Sarah sat alone at her usual table in the mess hall, a letter in her hands that wasn't really a letter. To any observer, it appeared to be a personal correspondence, envelope slightly worn, handwriting in blue ink, the kind of thing a recruit might receive from family back home. In reality, it was an intelligence report, carefully disguised by her handler at the Pentagon. The pages contained the latest developments in the investigation, confirmations of which soldiers had witnessed assaults and were too frightened to speak up, and most importantly, a comprehensive list of 17 victims spanning the past 18 months. 3 of them were still on base. The others had transferred, quit, or in one disturbing case, attempted suicide before being medically discharged. Sarah had memorized every name. She'd studied every account. She knew the patterns of attacks, always aggressive, always calculated to intimidate without leaving bruises on visible skin. She understood Tyler's role, the false friend who created situations of vulnerability. She documented Jake's methods through observation, the specific pressure points he used, the way he controlled his strength to maximize pain without causing fractures. And she'd recognized Devon's strategy, the way he positioned himself as almost sympathetic, the older brother figure who understood, who could help, who just needed one small thing in return. For the past 3 weeks, Sarah had been deliberately positioning herself as an ideal target. She'd made sure to eat alone, always at the same time, always at the same table. She'd cultivated a reputation for weakness through her running times and her quiet demeanor. She dressed in slightly ill-fitting clothes that suggested insecurity rather than military bearing. She'd made eye contact with exactly twice in the cafeteria, quickly looking away both times in a manner that communicated fear and submission. She'd allowed herself to be slightly clumsy during a training exercise, dropping her rifle in front of Tyler. She'd done everything possible to paint a target on her back. The waiting had been the hardest part, not the physical strain of maintaining her cover, that was easy after years of SEAL training, not the emotional exhaustion of pretending to be someone she wasn't, that was simply a tactical requirement. The hardest part was restraint. Every single day, she witnessed interactions that made her want to act. A junior recruit being cornered by Devon with that practiced sympathetic smile. An officer walking past without seeing what was happening. The countless small violations of dignity and safety that comprised the daily reality of this unit. But she'd waited, because Sarah understood something that many people didn't. Rushing to stop one assault might prevent that particular incident, but it wouldn't change the system. Stopping Tyler, Jake, and Devon required more than tactical intervention. It required documentation, proof, irrefutable evidence, and it required them to make a move against her, someone who could fight back, someone who would survive to testify, someone whose credibility would be unassailable. That evening she'd chosen her outfit carefully. Slightly loose athletic wear that suggested physical weakness, her hair down rather than pulled back, making her appear more vulnerable. She'd eaten quickly, not lingering, creating the impression that she was trying to remain invisible. As she stood to leave, she'd felt their eyes on her. Tyler, Jake, and Devon, all four of them at a table near the exit, all four of them watching her with the predatory focus of wolves who'd identified prey. The corridor outside the mess hall was positioned exactly as she'd remembered from her initial reconnaissance. It was a connecting passage between the dining facility and the supply area, rarely monitored by cameras due to a convenient maintenance issue that had never been resolved. The walls were concrete, unforgiving. The lighting was dim. There were no witnesses, no one to intervene, no chance of external help. It was, in every way, the perfect location for what they had planned. Sarah was halfway down the corridor when she heard the footsteps. 4 sets, approaching from behind with the confidence of predators who'd done this before. She didn't break stride. She didn't increase her pace. She simply maintained her steady walk, her mind already running through the tactical calculations, distances, angles, force requirements, injury assessments. She was running through scenarios the way a chess player anticipates moves, but with the added dimension of physical violence, and the knowledge that these men genuinely believed they held all the power. "Hey, Martinez." His voice came from directly behind her, close enough that she could smell the protein shake on his breath. She turned slowly, her face registering the appropriate amount of surprise and fear, was smiling, that predatory smile that had worked so effectively on every previous victim. Tyler stood to his left, already laughing that nervous laugh. Jake blocked the exit behind them, his massive frame filling the corridor. Devon approached from the side, his expression sympathetic, almost concerned. "We need to talk to you about something," Devon said, his voice gentle and reasonable. "Just some base traditions, nothing to be afraid of." Sarah's heart rate remained perfectly steady. Her breathing stayed controlled. Every fiber of her being was calm, composed, ready. She'd trained for this moment for 3 weeks, but more than that, she'd trained for this moment her entire career. The difference between a victim and a warrior wasn't size or strength. It was preparation. It was knowledge. It was understanding exactly what was about to happen and being completely, utterly ready for it. "Okay," she said quietly, her voice trembling just slightly, the perfect touch of fear. "What kind of traditions?" She was about to find out if 30 seconds would be enough time to destroy everything they'd built. Shoved her against the concrete wall with more force than he'd intended, but the impact only made him smile wider. This was his favorite part, that moment of initial contact when a victim's eyes went wide with the realization that resistance was futile. The wall was unforgiving, and Sarah's back connected with a dull thud that echoed slightly in the empty corridor. Pain bloomed across her shoulder blades, but she didn't cry out. Instead, she gasped, a small, frightened sound that was exactly what wanted to hear. "That's right," he whispered, moving closer, his breath hot and aggressive. "You're gonna learn what it means to be part of this unit." Tyler grabbed her collar from the left side, his fingers finding the fabric of her uniform shirt and twisting it slightly, pulling her away from the wall only to slam her back against it again. The second impact was harder than the first, and this time Sarah did cry out, a small, pained whimper that communicated surrender. Her head was spinning slightly from the impact, but her mind remained perfectly clear. She was cataloging everything. The exact pressure of Tyler's grip, the specific angle of his approach, the position of Jake's massive frame blocking the exit. Jake, meanwhile, had circled behind her. His hands came around her left arm, wrenching it upward into a position that would have dislocated the shoulder of someone with less training. Pain shot through her deltoid and rotator cuff, genuine pain, though not incapacitating. Sarah let out another small cry of distress, exactly the kind of noise that would reinforce their belief in her vulnerability. Devon stood to the side, watching with that practiced expression of concern, already preparing the psychological framework he would use later to convince her that this was somehow her fault. "Please," Sarah whispered, making her voice crack slightly. "I didn't do anything." "Exactly," said, leaning in close enough that she could smell the energy drink residue on his teeth. "You didn't do anything. That's the problem. You came here thinking you could just disappear, just blend in, just get through without contributing to the unit. That's not how we work." He placed his hand on her throat, not squeezing, just resting his palm there, a clear demonstration of his ability to do far worse. "You're gonna remember this. Every single day for the rest of your military career. You're gonna think about this moment and know that you belong to us now." That was his mistake. Not the violence itself, not the assault or the threats. The mistake was the confidence, the absolute, unshakable belief that he was dealing with a victim, someone broken, someone frightened, someone fundamentally weaker than himself. That confidence made him careless. It made him drop his guard for the briefest fraction of a second, the kind of moment that separates survival from disaster in close-quarters combat. Sarah's body moved with the efficiency of 1,000 training hours compressed into explosive action. Her left heel drove backward in a controlled strike, connecting precisely with Jake's right knee at an angle designed to exploit the joint's vulnerability. The strike wasn't wild or panicked. It was measured, professional, perfectly calibrated to cause maximum damage with minimum wasted energy. Jake's scream tore through the corridor, a sound of pure agony as ligaments tore and bone shifted in ways nature hadn't intended. He released her arm immediately, both his hands flying down to clutch his destroyed knee. Sarah pivoted on her right foot, using the momentum to rotate her entire body toward Tyler. His grip on her collar became a liability. He was literally holding her in position for what came next. She grabbed his wrist, twisted it using a pressure technique that exploited the small bones of his hand, and used his own grip against him as leverage. Tyler's body followed the path of least resistance, his trajectory carrying him directly into, who was still processing what had happened. Both men went down in a tangle of limbs, hitting the wall and then the ground with enough force to knock the wind from his lungs. Tyler landed on top of him, adding another 180 pounds of dead weight to the collision. Devon charged forward, the manipulator trying to become the fighter, a transition he'd never actually trained for. This was his mistake. Sarah his wild haymaker with minimal movement, letting his momentum carry him forward. As he passed, her hand came up in a precise strike to the pressure point on his neck, not hard enough to cause permanent damage, but more than sufficient to compress the vagus nerve and trigger an involuntary response. Devon crumpled, his body shutting down in confusion as his neurological system couldn't process the sudden flood of signals. 30 seconds, that's all it took. Was struggling to breathe, his ribs throbbing from the impact with the wall. Tyler was pinned beneath him, dazed and confused. Jake was incapacitated, his shattered knee making him a non-threat for the immediate future. Devon was on the ground, gasping for breath, his muscles temporarily unresponsive to his brain's commands. Sarah straightened her uniform calmly, brushed dust from her sleeves, and took a breath. Her heart rate was elevated but controlled. Her breathing was steady. She hadn't even broken a sweat. Now came the moment that would change everything, the moment when these four men would discover exactly who they'd just tried to attack. She reached into her pocket and her military identification. The real one, the classified one, the one that had been hidden in her records the entire time she'd been undercover. She held it up where all four men could see it clearly. "Lieutenant Commander Sarah, Navy SEAL Team 6, she said, her voice now carrying the authority of her actual rank, all pretense of fear completely gone. "You just assaulted a commissioned officer. That's a federal crime. Get up." The color drained from their faces in real time. Eyes went wide with the understanding of what had just happened. Tyler's mouth fell open as his brain struggled to reconcile the small, frightened girl he'd been attacking with the impossibility of what he was seeing. Jake, despite his destroyed knee and overwhelming pain, understood immediately that his life had just fundamentally changed. And Devin, the manipulator, the man who'd convinced 17 people that their suffering was somehow their own fault, realized that he'd been the one being manipulated all along. The base commander's office was cold, sterile, and absolutely silent except for the sound of breathing. Sat in a metal chair across from Commander James, his hands trembling slightly despite his attempts to keep them still. His left eye was beginning to swell where his head had hit the wall. Tyler sat in an adjacent chair, his collar torn, his expression a mixture of shock and denial. Jake was in the medical bay, his knee already confirmed as requiring reconstructive surgery. Devin Cole was in another office, being questioned separately, his manipulator's instincts clearly failing him as he faced the reality of military justice. Commander was a career officer with 28 years of service, and his expression was one of barely controlled fury. He'd been briefed on who Sarah really was approximately 30 seconds after the incident in the corridor. He'd been told about her undercover assignment. He'd been shown the classified file that detailed 18 months of investigation into a hazing ring that he, as the commanding officer of this entire unit, should have detected and stopped years ago. "Walk me through it," said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Every single detail." Opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. The words that came out were halting, disjointed, a man trying to construct a narrative that would somehow minimize what had just happened. She was the new recruit and we were going to. It was hazing, standard initiation, nothing that bad, everyone goes through. "Everyone goes through assault," interrupted, his voice dropping even lower, which somehow made it more terrifying. "Everyone has their arm wrenched behind their back. Everyone gets slammed against a wall. Is that your testimony?" Fell silent. Within an hour, the security footage from the base's camera system had been reviewed. The convenient maintenance issue with the corridor's cameras, suddenly resolved. Turns out the cameras had been working perfectly the entire time and the footage showed everything. Not Sarah's perspective. She'd positioned herself outside the camera's view, but the full context of the assault. 4 military personnel, clearly initiating contact with a junior recruit, clearly using physical force, clearly committing assault on film. By evening, the base was in controlled chaos. Officers were moving between buildings. Personnel files were being pulled. Witness lists were being compiled. And most importantly, 3 other recruits who'd been broken by this operation and had transferred off the base were being located and contacted. They had information. They had documentation. They had names and dates and incident reports they'd filed that had mysteriously disappeared from official channels. The news spread through the barracks like wildfire. Sarah wasn't a recruit. She was a Navy SEAL, and she'd taken down the 4 men who'd been running a systematic abuse operation for over a year. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Recruits who'd been forced to participate in hazing, who'd been coerced into helping identify new targets in exchange for being left alone, suddenly realized they had an opportunity to speak. The carefully maintained code of silence that had protected Tyler, Jake, and Devin for so long shattered like glass. Within 24 hours, 12 additional witnesses had come forward with accounts of abuse spanning months. Sarah sat in a separate office, giving her formal statement to the investigating officer. She was calm, precise, clinical in her descriptions. She described the assault without emotion, cataloging each moment with the kind of detail that only came from extensive training. She described her undercover assignment, the patterns she'd observed, the systematic nature of the operation. She identified 17 victims by name, along with dates and locations of incidents she'd personally witnessed or documented through careful observation. They were efficient, she said, her voice steady and professional. They'd clearly developed this into a system. New recruits would be identified, usually through Devin Cole, who had a remarkable ability to spot vulnerability. Then Tyler would make initial contact, establishing himself as a potential ally, would create a situation where the recruit felt indebted or trapped. Jake would deliver physical reinforcement. And finally, Devin would normalize it, convince the victim that reporting would be pointless because nobody would believe them, and that this was simply how military units functioned. The investigating officer, a stern woman named Lieutenant Commander Williams, was taking extensive notes. In your professional opinion as a SEAL operator, how significant was this operation? Sarah considered the question carefully. It was sophisticated. It was organized. It had institutional support. Captain received at least 3 formal complaints about hazing activities in this unit and took no action. That's either corruption or gross negligence. Possibly both. The 4 men we arrested are predators, but they're predators who'd been allowed to operate because the system that was supposed to stop them had failed. That's the more significant issue. By the 3rd day of the investigation, Captain James was being questioned by military police. The complaints he'd filed away were suddenly very relevant. So was his correspondence with other officers who'd reported concerns about his unit's aggressive culture. The culture he decided to tolerate rather than address. The culture that had resulted in at least 1 suicide attempt and the permanent discharge of multiple promising military personnel. Devin Cole, faced with irrefutable evidence and the testimony of a Navy SEAL, began to cooperate with investigators. He provided names. He described the system in detail. He hoped, naively, that cooperation might reduce his sentence. Instead, it only confirmed how calculated and systematic the abuse had been. This wasn't spontaneous bullying. This was an organization, a criminal enterprise operating within the military system. On the other hand, remained defiant. His lawyer advised him to stay silent but couldn't help himself. His confidence hadn't been completely shattered, it had been redirected. He still believed he was the powerful one, that Sarah's victory was somehow a fluke, that real justice wouldn't actually be served because the military protected its own. He was about to discover how wrong he was. The military investigation room was designed to be intimidating. Harsh fluorescent lighting, a metal table bolted to the floor, recording equipment visible in every corner. Sarah sat across from, with Lieutenant Commander Williams and 2 JAG officers present. Had waived his right to legal counsel, a decision his military-appointed lawyer had strongly advised against but which had insisted upon. He still believed he could talk his way out of this, that his confidence and strength would somehow translate into persuasiveness with military authorities. He was about to discover the first critical difference between bullying a frightened recruit and facing a Navy SEAL in a formal setting. "Walk me through your version of events," Sarah said, her voice calm and professional. She wasn't angry. Anger was an emotion that would suggest she'd been hurt by his actions. Instead, she was simply presenting facts, the way a prosecutor presents evidence, the way a surgeon describes a procedure. "She came at us," said, his voice carrying a note of indignation. "We were just talking to her, trying to help her understand unit standards, and she attacked. 4 of us, and she took us all down. That takes training. Military training. She's not a recruit. This whole thing is a setup." "A setup," Sarah repeated, her tone suggesting she found the claim mildly interesting rather than offensive. By whom? By the command structure. They wanted someone to. I'm asking, Sarah interrupted, specifically who set up a scenario where you committed assault on a commissioned officer on video, with witnesses, and admitted to a pattern of systematic abuse spanning 18 months. Who would orchestrate that? What would be the military advantage? His face flushed. You knew it was coming, you provoked us. I positioned myself in the mess hall at the same time every day for 3 weeks, Sarah said, her tone now taking on the quality of someone explaining something to a particularly slow student. I wore clothes that suggested insecurity. I ate alone. I made eye contact indicating fear. I allowed myself to appear clumsy during training exercises. These are standard tactical positioning methods. The question isn't whether I was aware you might attack. The question is whether you have any defense for attacking a military personnel in your unit. Lieutenant Commander Williams slid a folder across the table. Inside were photographs, surveillance stills from the corridor showing hands on Sarah's throat, Tyler pulling her collar, Jake wrenching her arm. Clear, irrefutable, devastating evidence. These are from the base security cameras, Williams said. The ones that were supposedly under maintenance. The ones that have been working perfectly the entire time, recording everything. His confidence began to crack, but he held on. That's just one incident. That doesn't prove. That's not actually why I'm here, Sarah interrupted. She pulled out a separate folder, much thicker than the first. I'm here to discuss the other 17 incidents. The recruit named who was beaten unconscious by you while held him down. The female officer who was sexually harassed by Devin Cole and coerced into sexual contact in exchange for being left alone. The junior enlisted personnel who were forced to participate in identifying new targets in exchange for being left relatively untouched. The 3 formal complaints filed against this unit by previous commanders that were ignored by Captain. Those incidents. Stared at the folder. I want my lawyer. Too late, Williams said flatly. You waived that right 20 minutes ago. You're going to sit here and listen to Lieutenant Commander describe in meticulous detail exactly what you've been doing for the past 18 months, and then you're going to be charged accordingly. What followed was one of the most devastating testimonies ever delivered in a military investigation. Sarah described patterns. She described methodology. She described the specific techniques used to maximize intimidation while minimizing visible injury. She described his preference for targeting recruits with no support system, no friends, no witnesses. She described how he'd positioned himself as someone who'd help recruits who were struggling, only to use that access to isolate and assault them. She described Tyler's role in a way that made his manipulative friendliness sound predatory rather than sympathetic. She detailed Jake's specific methods, the pressure points he preferred, the way he'd clearly studied anatomy to understand exactly how much force could be applied without causing permanent injury. And she described Devin Cole with particular precision, the way he'd position himself as almost a confidant, almost a mentor, almost someone who actually cared, before using that position of trust to normalize abuse. The investigation expanded. Witness after witness was called. The 3 recruits who transferred off the base arrived back at SAN to provide testimony. They described nightmares, anxiety disorders. One young man described his suicide attempt in clinical detail, how he'd stood in his barracks room with a rope, how the only thing that stopped him was the realization that he wanted to live more than wanted him dead. A female officer named Captain Reeves came forward and described, in explicit detail, the sexual coercion she'd experienced at Devin Cole's hands, how he'd used his charm to isolate her, how he'd convinced her that reporting would destroy her career, how she'd spent 6 months in therapy trying to reclaim her sense of agency and safety. By the end of the 3rd week of investigation, the case against was unassailable. The evidence was overwhelming. The testimony was consistent. The pattern was undeniable. military prosecutors began building their case for court-martial, and they did so with the full backing of the admiral overseeing the investigation. Captain James received his own summons. His files were reviewed. His decisions regarding the previous complaints were scrutinized. He'd received formal allegations of hazing and had chosen to file them away rather than investigate. That choice, made in the supposed interest of protecting his unit's reputation, was about to cost him his career. And through it all, Sarah stood at the center of the investigation, not as a victim seeking justice, but as a commissioned officer presenting evidence, as a trained investigator describing methodology, as a Navy SEAL whose credibility was absolutely unshakable. No jury would doubt her. No defense attorney could effectively cross-examine her. No amount of character assassination could dent her credibility. For the first time in 18 months, understood that he'd made a terrible mistake. Not in assaulting Sarah. In assaulting someone who was trained, prepared, and positioned to destroy him completely. The military courtroom was formal, austere, filled with the weight of institutional authority. A military judge sat elevated above the proceedings, flanked by the court clerk and the court reporter. A panel of 7 senior officers served as the jury, commissioned personnel with decades of service, people who understood the gravity of what was being tried. The prosecution table held 2 JAG officers and Sarah, who would serve as the primary witness. The defense table held Tyler and their respective military-appointed defense attorneys. The trial lasted 6 days. 6 days of testimony, evidence presentation, and cross-examination that systematically dismantled every defense the accused men attempted to construct. The prosecution's case was devastating in its precision. They presented the surveillance footage first, clear, irrefutable, showing the assault in the corridor. They presented medical records documenting Jake's destroyed knee and the permanent damage that would end his military career. They presented psychiatric evaluations of the other victims, showing PTSD, anxiety disorders, depression, and in 3 cases, diagnosed major depressive disorder directly attributable to the abuse they'd suffered. Then Sarah took the stand. She was methodical, clinical, and absolutely unshakable. The prosecution walked her through her undercover assignment step by step. She described how she'd positioned herself as a target. She described the patterns she'd observed. She described the assault in meticulous detail, not as a victim seeking sympathy, but as a trained observer documenting methodology. The defense attorney, a captain named Robert Hayes, attempted to construct a narrative of entrapment. "You deliberately positioned yourself as a target, correct?" he asked, his tone suggesting she'd somehow engineered her own assault. "I positioned myself as someone who appeared vulnerable," Sarah corrected, her voice steady. "That's standard investigative technique. Are you suggesting that appearing vulnerable somehow justifies assault?" "I'm suggesting that you're not a typical recruit." "I'm aware," Sarah interrupted. "I'm a Navy SEAL conducting an investigation into criminal activity within this unit. That doesn't change the fact that the 4 defendants committed assault on a military officer. It also doesn't change the fact that they've been systematically assaulting other personnel for 18 months. Hayes tried another angle. The other victims, couldn't they have simply reported the incidents through proper channels? Sarah's response was cutting. Captain received 3 formal complaints about hazing in this unit and took no action. What proper channels are you referring to? The ones that failed every single victim before me. By the 3rd day, the defense strategy had collapsed. The evidence was simply too overwhelming. The testimony too consistent. The pattern too clear. Then came the testimony of the other victims. The recruit who'd been beaten unconscious described the assault in vivid detail. He described waking up in the infirmary with no memory of how he'd gotten there. He described the psychological aftermath, the constant anxiety, the hypervigilance, the way his entire military career had been derailed by trauma he hadn't caused and couldn't control. Captain Reeves about the sexual coercion, her voice steady but her hands trembling slightly as she described the power imbalance, the manipulation, the violation of trust. She described months of therapy, the dissolution of her marriage because her husband couldn't understand why she'd become distant, the way she still couldn't be alone in a room with a man without experiencing panic. Another recruit, a 22-year-old named Daniel Foster, described being forced to participate in identifying new targets in exchange for being left relatively untouched. His guilt was visible and acute. He'd been complicit in the victimization of others while being victimized himself. He'd been trapped between the predators and their prey, and the psychological damage of that position was evident in every word he spoke. By the time the prosecution rested its case, the 7 officers on the jury panel looked grim, resolved, and absolutely certain of what needed to happen. The defense presented their case in 2 days, claimed the assault was mutual combat, a claim that was destroyed when the surveillance footage clearly showed him initiating contact with someone who didn't fight back until attacked. Tyler claimed he was just following his lead, a defense that suggested he had no independent moral agency, which somehow made him seem even more culpable. Jake's attorney focused on his client's destroyed knee, attempting to frame him as the victim, a strategy that backfired spectacularly when the prosecution presented medical records showing he destroyed other people's bodies with similar precision and calculated control. Devin Cole, the most intelligent of the 4, attempted a different strategy. His attorney presented character witnesses, people who to his charm, his apparent kindness, his social skills. The prosecution countered by presenting Captain Reeves again, by showing emails where Devin had manipulated recruits into silence, by demonstrating that his entire persona was constructed specifically to facilitate predation. The closing arguments were brutal. The prosecution's JAG officer described a systematic operation designed to break people, to create trauma, to establish dominance through violence and psychological manipulation. She described 4 men who'd calculated exactly how far they could push before leaving evidence, who protected each other through loyalty to predation rather than to service. The defense attorney attempted to frame the assault as isolated incident, a regrettable moment of poor judgment rather than evidence of systematic criminality. It was a transparent argument, and it landed like a stone in still water, creating ripples of nothing. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. Was convicted of aggravated assault, conspiracy, and sexual harassment. Dishonorable discharge. 15 years in military prison. Tyler was convicted of assault and conspiracy. 12 years in military prison. Jake, despite his injury, was convicted of aggravated assault, conspiracy, and torture. 10 years in military prison. His knee injury meant he would serve his sentence in relative agony, a poetic justice that nobody in the courtroom felt compelled to mourn. Devin Cole, the manipulator, received 8 years after his attorney's strategy of cooperation slightly reduced his sentence. But 8 years was still 8 years. 8 years in a military prison where his charm would mean nothing, where his manipulation would be recognized immediately by men far more dangerous than the recruits he'd preyed upon. Captain James faced a separate trial. He was convicted of dereliction of duty for ignoring formal complaints about hazing in his unit. He received a dishonorable discharge and 3 years in military prison. And Sarah, who'd come to Naval Station San as a ghost, left as something far more significant, proof that the system could actually work, that accountability could be achieved, that predators could be stopped if someone was willing to stand against them with absolute certainty and unshakable conviction. 6 weeks after the final verdict, Sarah stood in the commander's office one last time. The office had changed occupants. The new commanding officer, a rear admiral named Victoria Marks who'd been brought in specifically to restore the integrity of the unit, sat behind the desk with an expression of genuine respect. Admiral Marks had built her entire career on one principle. Accountability wasn't punishment, it was healing. The unit at Naval Station Sand needed healing, and she'd spent the past month beginning that process. "We'd like you to consider a permanent assignment here," Admiral Marks said, her voice carrying the weight of authority but also something else, genuine care for what happened next. "Help us rebuild. Show recruits what integrity looks like. Demonstrate that the system can actually work." It was a compelling offer. Sarah understood the tactical advantage. Her presence on the base would serve as a constant reminder that corruption had consequences. Her leadership would help establish a new culture where reporting violations wasn't career suicide but a fundamental obligation. She could reshape this unit from within, could create a template for other bases struggling with similar issues. It made perfect logical sense. Sarah took exactly 30 seconds to consider it. Then she shook her head. "With respect, Admiral, I need to get back to the teams," she said, her voice steady and certain. "My brothers and sisters are in the field and they need experienced operators. I came here to do a job. That job is done. The next job is waiting." Admiral Marks nodded slowly, and Sarah could see the moment of understanding cross her face. The recognition that Sarah's commitment to her SEAL team ran deeper than administrative effectiveness. "I understand," Marks said. "You've given us what we needed. Thank you for that." The paperwork was processed quickly. Sarah's undercover assignment was officially concluded. Her real identity was restored in all official channels. Her SEAL credentials were reactivated. And on a Thursday morning, exactly 8 weeks after she'd arrived at Naval Station Sand as a ghost, she prepared to leave as something far more significant. She stood at her locker in the barracks for the last time, removing the few personal items she'd accumulated during her time undercover. The photograph of her handler's family went into the recycling bin. The worn running shoes were donated to the base fitness center. The small Bible, actually an intelligence briefing manual in disguise, was collected by her handler. Her uniform, the one she'd worn while pretending to be someone she wasn't, was carefully folded and placed in her duffel bag. As she carried her bag toward the exit, something unexpected happened. Recruits began appearing in the corridors, not organized, not formally arranged, but somehow knowing that she was leaving. They lined the hallways in small groups, standing at loose attention, their eyes following her as she walked past. Some of them were victims who'd. Some of them were recruits who'd been forced to participate in the hazing ring. Some of them were simply young soldiers who'd heard the story and understood what Sarah represented. Was there the recruit who'd been beaten unconscious? His eyes met hers with a mixture of gratitude and something else, the beginning of healing, perhaps, or at least the hope that healing was possible. He nodded slightly. She nodded back. Captain Reeves waited at the gate in her dress uniform. "Thank you," she said simply, extending her hand. Sarah shook it, feeling the strength in Reeves' grip, understanding that this woman had reclaimed something of herself through the process of watching her abuser receive justice. "You gave us our lives back." "You gave yourselves your lives back," Sarah corrected. "You had the courage to speak up. That took more strength than anything I did." The transport back to her actual assignment left at 1400 hours. Sarah sat by the window watching Naval Station Sand disappear behind her. Part of her, the part that appreciated the satisfaction of a mission completed, felt the weight lifting. The operation was concluded. The predators were imprisoned. The system, at least at this one base, had been forced to acknowledge its failures and begin the process of reform. But another part of her, the part that never fully disconnected from the pain of others, carried something else away from Sand. It wasn't guilt, exactly. It was responsibility. The understanding that what had happened at this base was happening at dozens of other bases across the military. That there were predators operating in the shadows at this very moment, protected by the same system of silence and willful ignorance that had protected. Her SEAL team was stationed at Naval Base, 40 minutes south. When she arrived that evening, her brothers and sisters in arms were waiting. Not formally. SEALs didn't do formal homecomings. But they were there, sitting in the ready room, grinning at her like she'd just returned from a particularly difficult training exercise rather than 8 weeks of undercover work. Lieutenant James Doc stood up, a grin spreading across his face. "Welcome back, we missed you. How was your vacation?" "Productive," Sarah said, dropping her duffel bag on the bench. "I took down a hazing ring, got 4 predators imprisoned, and reformed an entire unit's command structure. Pretty standard stuff." The team erupted in laughter and cheers. This was what she'd been missing, not the excitement or the danger, but the absolute, uncomplicated respect of people who understood exactly what she was capable of. No need for explanation. No need for validation. Just the recognition of a job completed by someone they trusted completely. That night, as Sarah sat in the barracks reviewing operational briefs for her next assignment, she reflected on something Admiral Marks had said during their final conversation. "You changed the culture here," the Admiral had mentioned. "In 8 weeks, you changed the fundamental dynamic of an entire unit." Sarah had corrected her then, but now, alone with her thoughts, she understood that there was truth in the statement. Not because of anything she'd done individually, but because she demonstrated something that had seemed impossible before, that the system could actually work, that corruption could be exposed, that predators could be stopped, that accountability wasn't just a word, it was a possibility. As she read through the mission briefs for her next assignment, a direct action raid in a hostile location, Sarah understood that this was the real mission. Not the spectacle of 8 weeks undercover, but the constant, grinding work of being someone who refused to accept compromise, who refused to tolerate corruption, who understood that integrity was worth fighting for. Tomorrow she would brief with her team. Next week, they would deploy to a location she couldn't yet discuss. And somewhere down the line, there would be another assignment, another mission, another opportunity to prove that strength wasn't about dominance but about standing against darkness. As the morning sun rose over Naval Base, Sarah, ghost no longer, seal forever, prepared for whatever came next, carrying with her the absolute certainty that some things were worth fighting for. Not for recognition, not for reward, but because they were simply, fundamentally right. And that she'd learned at Naval Station San was enough.